In 1988, a new regional sports network was launched in Tallahassee, Florida. It was called Sunshine Network. Its first property was Florida State University Athletics, and the first announcer for those games was Paul Kennedy. 36 years later, Paul is still broadcasting Florida sports, and in that span, he's touched virtually every pro franchise and major college program in the state. It would take less time to tell you which Florida teams he hasn't broadcast. In this episode, we dive into that packed resume and follow his road to broadcasting, plus share some of his unique experiences outside the Sunshine State. My friend PK, Paul Kennedy, is a guest on Media Credentials.
I demand satisfaction.
My name is Whit Watson, and this is Media Credentials. I'm a sports announcer who's worked a lot of places. This podcast will peel back the layers of sports media and show you how the sausage gets made. Through interviews with industry pros and my own experience, you'll understand why you're seeing what you're seeing and who's responsible for it. Your Media Credentials have been approved. When the Orlando Magic played their first game in 1989, Paul Kennedy was hosting the broadcast. When the Tampa Bay Lightning played their first home opener in 1992, Paul was on the broadcast. He called Florida State football at the zenith of the Bobby Bowden era. He's called baseball for the Marlins and hockey for the Panthers. He is the Forrest Gump of Florida sports. Beyond Florida, Paul has called college basketball and football on Fox, Jefferson Pilot, and Raycom. He spent time with NFL Europe. He's covered basketball in Japan, golf in Mexico, and water skiing in France. Broadcasting has taken Paul around the world, but he makes his home in Orlando, commuting to Tampa, where he's still hosting Lightning broadcasts. When Sunshine Network hired me as a studio host in 2003, Paul and I became coworkers. He was gracious, he was welcoming, and very curious, with a range of interests outside of sports. And as you'll hear, he also has an uncanny memory. Paul, the toughest part about getting ready for this podcast was deciding where to start. Because you've worked everywhere, you've done everything, and I hate to leave anything out, but if I read your resume, it would take up all of the hour. So
don't do that.
I'm going to have to be selective. So anyway, hi, thanks for making time. How are you?
An honor, a privilege. We've known each other a long time. This is very flattering that you would invite me to join you. Really is.
I'm thrilled to have you, and there's some fun stories coming up. But before we get to that, let's go back to where it started. Where did you grow up, and how did you get started in broadcasting?
Where I grew up, we'd have to just predate that, actually. My father was career military, had been in the Second World War, Korea, and then took us in the 60s to Japan. We went back just 15 years after the war. We're back in Japan, where he had served in the Army of Occupation. He was an officer by now. But we would sit up at night, Whit, and listen to Armed Forces radio. My father, when I was 10, 11 years old, we would stay up to listen to college football or watch Japanese pro baseball, the Yomiuri Giants with Sadahara O, and things such as that. And so that piqued my interest in sports, a father-son relationship. We flew home. He was stationed at the Pentagon, his last duty station. And that was in the glorious era of Sonny Jurgensen and the Washington Redskins, Frank Howard, and the Washington Senators bombing home runs, Ted Williams, Wes Unseld, and the Washington Bullets at the time. And that is where I really got involved. Growing up in Washington, D.C. and in Northern Virginia at Fairfax High School, I developed more than a passion. With my sole ambition in life, and you might just laugh at me at this, was to be the radio play-by-play announcer for the Washington Bullets, so I could hang around and rub elbows with Unseld and Elvin Hayes and those people in the NBA. And this was in the 60s and 70s into the 80s. But that is where it really became a dream of mine. And you turn around, and now I'm at the other end of that saying, well, I came closer than I thought perhaps possible to meeting a lot of these heroes that I had.
Did you go to school for broadcasting?
No, I went to school at Virginia Tech because uh, I got into a major university. I was accepted at a major university. It was 4 hours away. I was the first person, thanks to my mother and father who had saved, that went away to a 4-year school to earn my degree. Virginia Tech did not have a school of communications, but they had a political science department. They had an English literature department, and they had a wonderful campus radio station and a very active and involved student newspaper, the Collegiate Times. And the door was wide open for me to get involved covering the teams at Virginia Tech. Don Strock at the time was leading the nation in passing. In basketball, when the NIT meant something, when they were only taking 16 teams for the NCAA, Don DeVoe and Sonny Smith, Alan Bristow, they won the NIT in Madison Square Garden. I got to cover all of that. So for a young person, when you were in college, didn't you find that to have the opportunity? I was Marty Brenneman's spotter, the great Hall of Fame Reds broadcaster.
Sure.
He broadcast Virginia Tech games because he had been doing the American Basketball Association in Virginia, the red, white, and blue basketball. But they asked him, and he agreed to do the Virginia Tech football games. And so I was his spotter and was assigned to go get Cokes. I was a lot better at getting Cokes than I was at spotting, I'll tell you. But those now, in retrospect, were priceless. What if he had said no to Don Lloyd Flieger, who had set it up, was a Hall of Fame broadcaster there? What if these doors that opened that you don't realize, it's almost the hand of providence that you had these opportunities come to you. And you turn around and 40 years later or so, you're still able to make a living at it.
People who have watched you in the state of Florida for years might not know that you spent 5 years as the radio voice of the Crimson Tide at Alabama. So what era are we talking about? Who were the coaches, the coach or coaches and the notable players at Alabama?
Well, I got hired by Vanderbilt first. Roy Kramer interviewed me for the Vanderbilt media relations opportunity to be the number 2 guy in the media relations opportunity. The salary wasn't much, but it was a wonderful opportunity because I got to be the color man on the Vanderbilt Basketball Network at a time when they were outdrawing everybody in the country. They had the number 1 attendance in the SEC at 15,000 in basketball. The football with Charlie Mack-Alexander, George McIntyre, the head coach. Charlie was broadcasting the games, Charlie Mack. They were playing the Alabamas and the Georgias and the Floridas of the world. And Coach Kramer, as you know, meant a lot to college football. So I was doing that, and lo and behold, I'm doing their baseball, and they win the SEC. And I get a phone call from Alabama, and they wanted someone to work in the marketing department. They were just starting. Ray Perkins, Coach Bryant, had just passed away in '83, and Ray Perkins had taken over, and he wanted me to come and broadcast. We're going to make changes across the board, and asked me to be the marketing director and to coordinate the football, basketball, and baseball network. They never had an individual do all 3, and I would do all 3 and move to Tuscaloosa. And so I was there for 5 years, and both experiences significantly different, but both in the SEC. And again, relationship building. I met a wealth of people, and it was fantastic in that Mike Shula was our quarterback, and I would end up through Mike meeting his father, Don Shula. And when I had an opportunity, they didn't, after Ray left to come to the Bucks, Steve Sloan came on as the athletic director. Bill Curry was the coach, and I did their games for 1 year. This is like 88. 87, 88. The last game I did was Michigan and Alabama, so I'd been there 5 years. I'd done basketball, which was phenomenal. Baseball in a time when Bo Jackson was in the SEC, and Frank Thomas and Albert Bell and Bobby Thigpen and Rafael Palmeiro, Will Clark in baseball. It was, and I'm in my 20s and early 30s, and I get up every morning and race to the front door and go to work. but they do not renew my deal. They do not renew my contract. They want their own guy. That's great. Eli would end up a couple of years later getting the job. He's a dear friend. But as that door closes, Dave Olmsted, you may remember him,
Sure.
regional sports networks, it's 1988, are just beginning. And imagine a world in which there is no NBA, there's no Heat, there's no Magic, there is no National Hockey League, there's no Lightning, there are no Panthers, there's no Major League Baseball, the Marlins, the Rays, in the state of Florida.
Only the NFL. All we had was the NFL at that time. That was it.
That's correct. And you had two franchises. You had the Bucks, where Ray is going, and you had the Dolphins, which at the time, I think, you may agree, disagree, was the biggest brand in Florida. That
far.
Didn't you think?
By far, yeah.
And Coach Shula at the time was still a very intimidating figure. And I feel like I was in way over my head, but we didn't have any South Florida programming. The programming we had was to broadcast Florida State replays of football and then do men's basketball, women's basketball, volleyball. How many sports did you do there, Whit, at that time? It was everything, baseball. It was all being televised for the first time. We were forming a regional sports network. The business model, these did not exist, and they were blossoming, and we were paralleling the expansion of the NBA. And less than a year later, what is then Sunshine Network is awarded the rights to the Orlando Magic, and we moved from a prefabricated building in Tallahassee to a high-rise in Orlando, and we're doing the shoulder programming for the NBA, and the Orlando Magic is born, the Heat is born, to be followed by the hockey teams, the Major League Baseball teams, and other programming. And I think it's just serendipity. We are there. And back to Coach Shula for a moment. We want to do a show because we don't have any South Florida programming. We said we need a show for South Florida. So we go to the Dolphins and say, what if we did a magazine show on you? And they said, why not a live call-in show once a week? It sounded good to us, and we negotiated a rights fee, and it has to be run up the flagpole. But nothing goes through the Dolphins at the time without coming across the desk of Don Shula. And Wayne Huizenga had just bought the Dolphins and the stadium. So one person, Wayne Huizenga, with Don Shula and Dean Jordan, who was his marketing genius, I knew Coach Shula, and he said, I know Paul from listening to the games. We were on WIOD radio in Miami when we would do the Alabama games. IOD did the Dolphins on Sunday, but Coach Shula, through his influence, would ask that when possible they would air the Alabama games so we could listen to them. There was no internet to have immediacy of radio broadcast. And his wife Dorothy said that he would pace the living room floor trying to do work while listening to us, for better or for worse, describe his son's games. So when I meet him, he goes, hey, I listen to you all the time. So I come in a different door with him. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
He's very nice. And I'll give you a perfect example. Now, he intimidated the heck out of me. We were not BFFs. But so we did the show. And we would pay the players, I believe it was $500 a piece, one on offense, one on defense, and send a limousine to get them, to pick them up. And they would have the car until midnight on Monday nights, and Tuesday was their off day. So Coach Shula would help pick the players, select the players, someone that had a good game in the rotation of players being fair, but he was rewarding them, and they could take their families or significant others and go out and have a nice evening. They wouldn't have to drive, and if they were going to have a cocktail, and then they would have Tuesday off. And this is before ESPN built all of its program leading into Monday Night Football. So we would have Name a Dolphin. If it was Marino or whoever, the Marx Brothers or Offerdahl, in that genre of Dolphins, we would have them on Monday nights for an hour, an offensive player and a defensive player, and show highlights and take calls. So this is like 90, 91, 92, 93. Mm-hmm. It was absolutely fantastic. Well, we show highlights, and I needed to go in post-game press conference. They had won, but I needed to ask Coach Shula, have you ever gone into a post-game coach's press conference, and whoever it is, in whatever sport, from women's basketball to lacrosse to basketball, their adrenaline is still way up. And you have seen them be short. A guy asks a question, and Coach Shula, it didn't fall on kind ears. And Coach Shula lets him know it didn't fall on kind ears. And he is straightforward with this guy. And I go, oh my God, here we go, Paul. Welcome to the end of my career. And you have all these peers. I don't know if they respect me, they're tolerating me. And I raise my hand. He goes, yeah. And I ask a question. It could be as simple as, don't you think that Whit cuts his lawn as nice as anyone in the neighborhood? It was something about that soft.
Mm-hmm.
But it was relative to a player. And this is what he does for me. He goes, Paul, that's a great question. And off he goes. Nice 45-second answer. And heads kind of glance and heads turn. It was not the question. It was him trying to help me.
Right.
And I think it was because I had tried to help his son, Mike,
right.
And I had tried to help the Dolphins. And
I'm glad you brought up Coach Shula because, again, to recap, Sunshine Network launches in 1988. The first property, as you said, was Florida State Athletics. The second major property was the Orlando Magic.
Mm-hmm.
So you had the privilege of covering Florida State, broadcasting Florida State throughout a sizable chunk of Bobby Bowden's tenure in Tallahassee. I met him and interviewed him a handful of times when you and I were working together. And Paul, he had a quality where when he was talking to you, he made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. I could easily understand why recruits' parents fell in love with Bobby Bowden.
The first day they sent me to Florida State, I did not know Wayne Hogan, the associate athletic director for media relations. I did not know Coach Bowden. And he comes out on the practice field. This is the week before they play Miami, and they would get blown out. But I wasn't smart enough to realize, I wasn't smart enough to know what I would be covering.
Mm-hmm.
I was just relieved that I had a job for another year. And he walks over on the practice field and puts his arm, I have never met the man.
Right.
And he puts his arm around me, literally, on my shoulder and said, hey, boy, we are glad to have you here. Whit, I'd have run through a wall for him.
Wouldn't you?
Then and there. I had never had a coach do that before. And this is 1988. Never had a coach do that before. I was always having to prove something to them. Here he was welcoming in and saying, help us. And I did. I stayed 25 years doing those replays, and they were replay games, not that, it evolved into primetime Knowles.
Right.
Our network grew into about 6 million households. But the reason I was doing that, because it became a family affair. I felt like I was a part of something far bigger than me. And I loved it. The aura of 14 straight double-digit win seasons and finishing in the top 5 and the galaxy of stars and sitting down with Mark Richt every Friday morning and Mickey Andrews at noon to tell us what was going to come up the next day and getting on a plane and going to the West Coast or to Syracuse or to Miami in an era in which Miami and Florida State, could you say, stopped the world?
It was the biggest game of the year. The biggest game of the year, especially in Florida. It was must-see TV every year.
I thought, and Deion Sanders was as polite as he could be. He'd say, my man, he would say. And now he's larger than life. Mickey Andrews and all the defensive backs that he would have. I would stand on the practice field. He played at Alabama, so some of the Alabama people called him and put in a good word for me. But we would sit in there and he coached by the way of saying to Leroy Butler, or to Terrell Buckley, Leroy Butler wouldn't have done it like that. Or to a young man, Deion Sanders worked harder than you are working right now. He wouldn't scream or be profane. He was never profane, but you are not working as hard as Deion Sanders would work. And go give me your mother's telephone number. I have to call and apologize. I told her you were going to play here, and I unfortunately have lied to her. Uh, go over to the tower and ask Coach Bowden to remind me why we gave you a scholarship. Dealing with 18-year-old young men. But to watch him work on the practice field and to watch Odell Higgins and Mark Richt and Dr. Tom Eason, who had the Fab Four wide receivers and all of that. I didn't realize, but I think Jim Gladden coaching the defensive ends and linebackers and all. You look back, don't you think in retrospect, you look back, it was the golden era of Florida sports, the state of Florida. All of these teams coming into being and all of them immediately going to the forefront of their respective leagues.
Well, in the early days of the Magic and the Lightning, it took a little while. I mean, the Magic got to the playoffs in their fifth season because of Shaquille O'Neal and Penny
Yeah.
Hardaway, and
Yeah.
the Lightning had an incredible start to their expansion season, and then things kind of tailed off. But and you were there for both of them. You were there on day one for both the Magic in Orlando and the Lightning in Tampa Bay a couple of years later, 1992. How primitive, I guess is the word I would use, were the broadcasts for those expansion teams in the late 80s, early 90s compared to what you work with now?
I would think it reflects where media was and the generation of production then. Have you looked at our colleagues at CBS, say on the day they ran the punt Ruski at Clemson that day, and see what the graphics look like, what the effects were like, what we call the teas and features were like? Have you looked at that and compare it to today? It's shocking how quickly it has evolved. It was much the same in basketball. Say with the Magic, even when they won 17 games, that very first season, and Pat Williams, the consummate promoter, it was thrilling with Chip Carey and Jack Gibbons. It was over the moon. Tom Hastings was the producer, director, coordinated graphics, got the technical director, but would go in to Madison Square Garden by himself. Now we travel an army. In hockey, this is fun. When I was in high school, back to Fairfax High School, I had Phil Esposito's poster from Sports Illustrated in my locker. You open the door and there it is. Him in his Boston Bruins uniform and his jet black hair. He looked like Elvis on hockey sticks or on hockey skates. And then to work with him as he was getting teams to come in like Gretzky and the Kings and the Boston Bruins, Mark Recchi and the New York Rangers, Patrick Waugh and the Montreal Canadiens, to come in and play exhibition games, Lou Lamoriello and the New Jersey Devils. All these are Hall of Fame people. I didn't know the difference. But to get them to come in and play barnstorming games to convince the NHL that the NHL would work here, and then to go and create out of a prefabricated building at the Exposition Grounds in Tampa, an arena they played their first game. I drive by it every day and chuckle every single time I go to Tampa. It was preposterous that they played a season there, but it was on the strength of his personality and 10,000 seats. But because of that, these people are now my friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wish that 15-year-old kid in Paul could see what was to come. I guess we could have gone on to law school, Whit. You certainly have the intellect. You could have been a doctor, a scientist, a rocket man, but it wasn't even a labor of love. It was a thrill every day to get up and do this and to have the realization on opening night, here it is. And there is nothing like the birth of a new franchise. And you and I experienced the Magic, the Lightning, the Marlins, Major League Baseball. I arrive here, and 4 or 5 years later, we're going to Wrigley Field and Shea Stadium and Dodger Stadium, and it was indescribable. And then I get a call because you're in the middle of the mix. It's all relationship built, right? You and professional golf taking you literally around the world. You get a call. We're starting a new baseball night in America, and we'll air our games syndicated on ABC and NBC. And we need someone to do about 20 games on each network. Would you be interested? Would your network let you do it? I think I can work that out.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I'll try. And so I went, and let me just say this. I don't know that social media of today would not have had me fired and I wouldn't have made it a second week. But you know what I'm saying? I
Yeah,
worked in a critics-free universe.
right.
And so I did games with Johnny Bench and Larry Durker and Steve Blass and Jay Randolph and Gary Carter, like that. And I would probably was in way over my head, but I didn't know it. And here we go. Let's go back to Hannah Storm and our Baseball Night in America studios on ABC. Only because I happened to be available. And now I look back on it and you say, how in the world did that happen? But it did.
It did. For a lot of years, including when you and I worked together, Sunshine Network became Sun Sports and what's now known as Bally Sports. You were hosting broadcasts for both the Lightning and the Magic and commuting back and forth between Orlando and Tampa. And I texted with a couple of former colleagues, Jamie Shapiro and Mike Wargo, and said, I've got PK on the podcast today. What do you want to ask him?
Those are two great producers, by the way.
And Jamie, who works for the Bally Sports South office in Atlanta now, said, as he recalled, at one point you had a run of something like 103 games in 108 days between hockey, basketball, and Florida State football. So our question is, how in the world did you pull that off?
Well, I will say this. It was the terminator of romantic relationships.
I'll bet.
Marv Albert, he wrote an autobiography entitled "I'd Love to, but I Have a Game."
Yep.
How close does that hit to home, right there? But Tom Hastings, to further your point, called me in early in the Panthers, and he said, "The host we have, we need to make a change. So go get your calendar." They laid out my calendar, and I was on a salary, and they said, "Okay, you're going to work. We're going to select the games. You're going to work on whatever days." So you had the Lightning, the Panthers, the Magic, and then baseball. And it was before we traveled with charters. You know, we flew commercial, and I think that helped the camaraderie of the early Magic. That you would be with David Steele and Goose Givens and Chip Carey, but you would also be with Jeff Turner and Mark Akers and Reggie Theus. In hockey, you would also be with Terry Crisp and Brian Bradley and Chris Kontos and Pat Jablonski. In baseball, well, baseball did have its own charter, and with Wayne Huizenga and John Van Beesbrook, you'd say, let's go to the Tim Hortons, I'll buy you a donut at the airport. So you were in their environment, and you just tried as hard as you could do to prepare. It was not easy, and probably the telecast today I don't want to say would be unacceptable, but you could research more than we did then. We did the best we could, and we got through it, and everybody was happy. And you also had terrific producers and directors and play-by-play men, John Kelly, Danny Gare. I fear that I will leave somebody out, Rick Peckham and Bobby the Chief Taylor, who would bring you along. I'll tell you a guy that was phenomenal, Denny Potvin, the Hall of Fame defenseman, put his arm around me and took me around the National Hockey League. And when we got to baseball, Gary Carter, I would say to him, Gary, I'm not going to walk from the hotel to the ballpark with you. It'll take us an hour, and all everyone wants is your autograph. But he would introduce you to great players. And then the players would come on and interview with you. He interviews Tony Gwynn. He'd say he's a good guy. So Tony Gwynn would do an interview. So I don't know what your methodology was, because you've done a lot of this. But don't you find that really helped if a star, a peer of those guys, opened the door for you? But I was on a plane. I could say I was honestly on a plane 4 days a week in the 90s, 12 months out of the year.
The preparation is something that I observed when I got to Sun Sports and you and I became coworkers. I really feel lucky to have had that experience because I learned a lot from watching you, from watching David Steele, two true professionals. I can recall sitting in your office and you showed me a handwritten notebook that you kept of every business phone call, who it was, what time it was, and what the topic was. That attention to detail, that willingness to prepare, where did that come from?
I think being in the environment of Vanderbilt, Alabama, and certainly at Alabama, they were driven to phenomenal levels. They hit the front door. The staff did at 6 a.m. But details, you were going so hard, so fast, and trying to keep up, really trying to make an effort to keep up. So you didn't overlook perhaps a sales pitch you had made to do shows. We were also doing shows with a guy by the name of Jeff DeMoss was charged with, and you've done a number of that we generated profitable shows that he created, produced, and sold, and we aired and syndicated across what is now Bally Sports or Fox Sports nationally, such as show jumping, equestrian events in Europe. We went to Ireland and did those. Golf events, we went to Mexico and to Kauai that Jeff would create and do. And so we were doing the production on those and selling those. Water skiing, believe it or not, on 3 continents. And so you had a lot of irons in the fire, but it was fun. It was thrilling. And and this is before really computers. When we moved here, when did you get your first computer? When was it? I feel like the old man, when we didn't have computers and we didn't have phones.
No, I stun my grown kids when I tell them this. I had a computer in college, but we had no internet. So basically it was a fancy typewriter. It was a word processor. So the first, I had AOL dial up when I was in my early 20s after college. And people cannot imagine how someone could go through college without the internet, without being able to look things up online, much less do this job. I can't imagine how we would do this job now without the internet.
You're absolutely correct. In doing Major League Baseball and trying as hard as I could try, and again, the motivation, the mantra for me was, I may not be successful, but I know that I won't be outworked, right? I'm going to try I'm going to try as hard as I can possibly try. Well, I'd come home at night from a game, and it was 10:30, 11 o'clock, knowing that the next morning you had to get 3 papers and devour them for content. I had the reading habits of a 15-year-old. Remember USA Today in its zenith that would have the national news. You had the Miami Herald in its zenith. Mm-hmm. And you had the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel in its zenith. You had the Orlando Sentinel with great writers and columnists, the Tampa Bay Tribune, the St. Pete Times, but you had to go into box scores and Zenith and all. And you didn't have today. Look at your iPhone. You have the sum total of mankind's knowledge in the palm of your hand. I can find out anything in an instant. I can see a box score in San Francisco in 20 seconds. I can know exactly what is going on with the 49ers out there. And we didn't have any of that. None of that existed. And I'm trying to think when it changed. Would that be late 90s, early 2000s is when it began to change. I remember living in London for Fox in a rotary dial, having a rotary dial phone in like the year 2000, or at least the connection was a rotary dial AOL, you've got mail. And then the Apple, when did the iPhone come into being? 02, 03?
Something like that. We'll go with that, sure.
Yeah, that sounds good enough. But that's when I became obsessed. And I've read far fewer books, although I've tried to maintain literary standards. But because the information flow is infinite now, don't you find? I mean, how much I've seen your charts for the PGA Tour.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Well, but you have to know what is germane to Nick Dunlap.
Right.
And you have to know it immediately.
You mentioned living in London, and I was going to ask you about that a little bit later, but I'll ask you now. You've spoken fondly over the years about being an announcer for NFL Europe. How did that opportunity come up?
It came through Conference USA football while we were doing Florida State football. Dave Olmstead created a league called Conference USA that they needed for all the Fox affiliates, their regional networks. They needed a way of getting, the eyeballs of college football play. So let's go back 25 years. They create a league of independent schools that they would own the rights to their home games for the telecasts for those member schools. Mike Slive was available. He was an attorney in Chicago at the time, the same Mike Slive that would go on to be the commissioner of the all-powerful Southeastern Conference.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he became the initial commissioner of Conference USA. That was the name he applied to it. And they enticed out of major television markets, Army, which gave you New York, Cincinnati, Louisville. The Carolinas came by way of East Carolina, Houston, Memphis. Southern Miss gave you further deep south. That was at the time when they were on more of an equal footing with Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Tulane, that gave you New Orleans. But they created that league. So we started doing those games, and we let off for Fox at noon. And we came out of their pregame show. Kevin Frazier, who now hosts, what is the entertainment show?
It's either Entertainment Tonight or Access Hollywood.
That's correct. For a significant amount more than he probably received for being our studio host.
I hope so.
Yeah. And but he would throw to myself and Brian Baldinger. We were doing these games. It was Baldy's first national television opportunity, and he knocked it out of the park. Had just come off the football field, and now he is a big deal in broadcasting for the NFL. But we did these games, and we would get Big Ten teams, we would get Southeastern Conference teams coming to these stadiums. And I got a call that Fox and the NFL were going to put together a development league in 6 NFL cities that would play 10 weeks in April to give players a development league. There is no minor league football, but to give quarterbacks that were the third quarterback, perhaps, or an offensive guard, the third or fourth guard, or linebackers, third or fourth guard, trying to give them 600 snaps in 10 games in April and May to mid-June, and then play a championship game. There would be NFL coaches that have been in the league, and every player would be allocated by an NFL franchise off of their development squads or men that had played that year in the NFL to come over there and play. Fox was going to do it for programming, and they need people that could go over. So they asked me, would I go over? And I called, I said, wait a second, you're asking me, would I go to London? You're going to put me up and then send me out each week with a production team, and we are going to do a game in London, Edinburgh, Amsterdam, Berlin, Frankfurt, Barcelona, and do games. Yes, I'd be very interested. I got permission to do it. And what Fox was also saying, they would send young broadcast associates, people that had been assistant directors, they would have them direct. They'd been broadcast associates, they make them producers. They would send young, just out of college or still in college, ambitious young men and women, make them broadcast associates. And this would give them an opportunity to get experience over 10 weeks. And we would be based in London, and we would fly out each week to do these games. And they would be televised nationally back here in the States in April, May, June. The men and women that came out of that are now the cornerstone and the backbone and the mainstream of Fox's production that includes the Super Bowls that they have done. Rich Russo was a director over there just getting started. He has maybe done 15 Super Bowls, maybe 10 Super Bowls, but he works with the number one crew. Troy Aikman was still playing for the Dallas Cowboys. He came over and worked with Brad Sham to learn the fundamentals, the blocking and tackling. and approached it like looking at film, interviewing players, and could not have been more humble or eager to learn. Troy Aikman, Kurt Menefee did this. That's where they all started. Kenny Albert was over there. I could go down the list, but that's how it got started. And I ended up doing that for 4 or 5 years.
Let's go big picture in sports media currently. The regional sports network model, as we've all read, seems to be in trouble. And as a matter of fact, I've asked several of our current and former colleagues who now work for other Bally Sports regionals to come on the podcast. And most of them are reluctant because there's so much uncertainty as to what's going to happen next. How does the NHL and the NBA solve the problem and keep the games on the air for their fans?
Well, this is far above my pay grade, far above my intellectual level. But I would say this, that we have brilliant people working on this and people that have a common interest in this succeeding. The leagues succeeding and receiving revenue, continuing to thrive, and these networks continuing to thrive. So I would say this as a hedge, not authorized to speak.
Right.
That would be what gives me confidence that we will work our way through this. I don't want to say that we have seen the entire bell curve of this, of the revenues that we have generated in years gone by. I think that I know this from our ability to produce and distribute games. We are a wonderful option and have proven to be great partners through the years. And I think we will continue to do so. How it evolves, I, like you, watch Bally Sports streaming all the time. I remember my first introduction to this. I got on the plane in April going to some city to do a game, and a guy was sitting in front of me watching the Masters on his iPhone. And I can recall saying, how in the world are you doing this? Who do you have to pay to do that? It never occurred to me that you can do it. And it's happened again in a warp speed amount of time. What would you think happens with what we're seeing? I am bullish on the fact that there will be networks and people that see the value in this, the Amazons and other concerns in what we're doing. It is the greatest reality show in the history of entertainment, unscripted sport. The numbers that we pull I saw Peacock had something like, how many people did they have register the other day? And I say this for the playoff game, the Kansas City playoff game at 20 below zero the other day. Was it 2.8 million or was it?
Yeah, it was in the millions. That they had in the millions of new subscribers. Yeah,
new unique subscribers.
Correct.
Which tells you I'm a faithful cable person still, but I'm not confessing. The truth be that I watch every platform I can watch, and we're on all the platforms, my wife Joan and I, to watch all that we can get our hands on. It's not helping me read books, but we have more access now than we have ever had to watching professional sport. And with the NFL ticket, NBA, NHL, Major League Baseball, I recall, and we're in Florida, and I have friends that produce, Kevin Patterson, Brad Bartle, that produce the Rays, and down south, Brett Updike's the executive producer here, oversees all of this in Florida Marlins down south. But you and I think I can say this, are card-carrying Boston Red Sox fans and have been historically. And I remember Joan and I paying whatever the price was summers ago to sit down and be able to watch at our discretion every single Red Sox game. So the convenience of that. I don't think we watch quite as many. I still enjoy going to Fenway and getting over to the Trop. I love, by the way, I loved But I still do. I love the Trop. I hosted the first telecast that ever came out of that building. I know when they built it. I have done games at Florida outside, and by Florida, I mean at what was then Joe Robbie Stadium, became Pro Players Stadium. It was the first home of the Marlins. But, it rains every day at 5 o'clock in South Florida in the summertime. And you and I would be drenched at 5 o'clock. But there's something to be said with for 72 degrees and you start on time in Major League Baseball. Weather is not an option. And in fact, it's comfortable. And I remember us doing hockey games in the Trop, what is now Tropicana Field, but baseball there doesn't bother me a bit. I love dome parks. I prefer sunshine when the weather is conducive to an agreeable evening or afternoon.
I'm glad you brought up Joan, the world's most patient woman. We're still waiting for her to speak her first words. You guys are both avid runners.
She is incredible.
How many marathons have you done?
I've done 10. I had done 3 before I met her in 2005. And she rekindled my willingness to train. I know you've run Boston. That is the golden chalice of running.
Yeah, but one was enough for me, Paul. I ain't doing 10.
Well, you have to prepare.
One was plenty.
It's, not the will to win, it's the will to prepare. Like in anything, people don't understand, like in preparing for a broadcast. Are you willing to grind? Are you going to lose the willingness? Head coaches, Saban, I believe he was telling us he's lost the edge to grind and prepare that is requisite with all of this. The world is starting to pass him by, not in terms of his acumen, but life. You only have so many years. But she has run 47 marathons.
Oh, come on.
That's correct.
47?
I can open a drawer and there are a dozen marathon medals in a drawer. What are you doing? We got to hang these up. And we were in with Marathon Fest and Track Shack, which is it changed my life. It's spiritual. It's as great as a cathedral, the Vatican of running in downtown Orlando. John and Betsy Hughes and their families, they run a marathon training program as well as sell apparel and shoes. But they are hosting the United States Olympic trials in February to see who goes to Paris. That it's amazing that the people, and I've gotten involved in that, and you meet people from all walks of life, that this is how they recreate. They can run shorter miles throughout the week, and then on Saturday they get together at 5:30 in the morning and they think nothing of running 10 miles. Doctors, lawyers, truck drivers, school teachers, and even humble broadcasters.
Is there anything in broadcasting that you haven't done that you'd like to do?
That's very interesting. I always said I would like to do a full season of baseball. I mean, call every day, but I don't know that you wish to pass up on a spring and summer and into the fall. When you commit to baseball, I did 90 games one year, and that was a lot when I was doing the Marlins. I've always thought I would like to do that. I like the Whitbread race, but we do that from afar. It's no longer Whitbread, the around the world race. I don't know. I broadcast equestrian events. I do like to travel. We did go a few years ago. We went with a group of friends and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And that was 6 days up and 2 days down. The 2 days down is harder than the 6 days up because you're on adrenaline going up to 19,000 feet. But I like those participatory shows. Do you remember the program that aired on Saturdays called ABC's Wide World of Sports?
Yep.
Yeah, I loved that. I can truly say I loved that magazine, Jim McKay. I would like to do the Olympics, I think, the potpourri of sport. And because in the Olympics, as great as it is, tales of first to the tape, jumping the highest, swimming the fastest, I think the backstories are what are really compelling. Who is this individual? What is she and he doing here? And why have they reached the pinnacle of their chosen pursuit. I find that, and when we went to NFL Europe, our marching orders were, everybody has a story. Find out what their story is. And I found that to be a wonderful piece of advice from Ed Gorin and Bill Brown, who were the founders of Fox Production. David Hill for Fox, when the Murdochs acquired the National Football League and created a network. And so, what about you? I'd like to do the real Olympics, and I do research. Just sit down and interview. I've done tennis with the greats. I remember being starstruck to being in a player's waiting room while we were doing the Champions Tour and going around the United States with McEnroe and Vitas Gerulaitis and Jimmy Connors. This is 20 years ago, and these great champions, and they would fill up arenas. And there was Bjorn Borg, and he was sitting there watching TV while it rained. We were in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I said, everybody's watching TV and chatting among themselves. They've been kind enough to welcome me in. And all I'm doing is staring at him going, my God, that's Bjorn Borg. And there was a time, was there a bigger name than Bjorn Borg? It was between Ali and Michael Jordan. There was Bjorn Borg, the great tennis champion.
How much longer do you think you'll stay on the air, Paul?
Maybe till the end of our visit here. And then maybe another year or two, because I would like to do at my own choosing other things. You know, when you commit to a hockey season, you commit to 80 days in playoffs, 80 games in playoffs. And the preparation, again, on those off days, what are you doing, Whit? What are you doing? You're preparing. So it's really every day. So there are other things, that I would like to do. I would like to see the world. Is there a place you haven't been with that you would like to travel to and touch and put your feet on the ground? I've had friends of mine. I have a friend, I went to London to their wedding, and it's my college roommate's daughter, and she's 30 years old now, and she is a teacher. She has a master's degree from the University of Virginia, and her husband is an Englishman, and they teach in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, at an English-speaking academy, and they love it. They have a beautiful apartment. Well, Vietnam, to me and you, we come out of a different era and a different perception of what is. My running shoes are made in Vietnam. I come out of the war in the 60s and 70s. I would like to go and see this beautiful country, Vietnam. I've never been there. I've been to Africa. I've never seen the pyramids. Are there places that I'd like to see the Great Wall of China? This sounds silly, like I'm the stream of consciousness here. Patagonia, Spain, what it looks like. But that requires time to do it. What about you? Is there something you would really like to do, Whit, that you haven't been able to do?
Talking about assignments, like calling a certain sport?
Yeah, take it on assignments. And then
I would like to go back and call baseball again. I had a lot of fun calling college baseball games with Sun Sports. Had the chance to do a lot of basketball back in the day.
Yeah.
And, I've been limited to one sport for a long time. And so there's a lot of sports that I'd like to go back and do again. Not necessarily events, just sports. Like, who doesn't love college football? I mean, what's a better environment than that? And as I wrap this up, I like to end these podcasts, Paul, with the same question. If you were going to give advice to someone today who was considering a career in sports media, what would you say?
That is a wonderful question, Whit. I would say this, that in television, there are 3 or 4 people that you see on camera at a football, baseball, basketball, hockey game. And there are 40 people working on that telecast. There are opportunities to be a producer, a director, a technical director, a graphics coordinator, an audio engineer, a video producer, a camera person that will take you around the world with a college degree. and take you right to the top. There's a friend of mine, an acquaintance from Europe named Steve Turnberger, and he goes each week to a different place. In fact, multiple places each week on Earth. I don't know that Steve has a home, but he's been doing this for years. It's event to event to event. You never know Steve on camera, but everybody in the business knows who he is because he's very sharp, if not brilliant. And he produces events that you see on ESPN and on Fox and on other networks. I always tell people that don't be fascinated or totally consumed with being on camera. Because I always say on the totem pole of our telecast, wouldn't you agree? We're not the eagle. I'm more of the chipmunk or the beaver at the bottom of the totem pole. And you can watch a game with the sound off and know what's going on. But you can't without the pictures and perhaps the graphics. I would encourage people to want to do that, to want to write scripts, to want to interview, to want to produce, to want to develop features. And that indeed will take you to all 7 continents of the world, and you'd have a phenomenal career.
In just a few seconds, we'll have some closing thoughts on this episode, so stay tuned. If you're enjoying it so far, please consider subscribing or sharing and leave a review. Let me know what you'd like to hear in the future on Media Credentials. Paul referenced Eli as the announcer who followed him at the University of Alabama. That would be the legendary Eli Gold, who, after missing the 2022 season with a cancer diagnosis, is still broadcasting games at Alabama on a reduced schedule. You also heard the term primetime Noles. When I started at Sunshine, the channel had the rights to produce Florida and Florida State football games on tape to re-air on Sundays. The Florida Gator game aired in the morning. It was called Breakfast with the Gators. The Florida State game would run at 7 p.m., branded as Primetime Noles. And lastly, PK talked about the Trop. In case you missed it, that's Tropicana Field, the indoor home of the Tampa Bay Rays. Paul said he adopted the philosophy that he would not be outworked. I've been saying that to myself for years. Never said it out loud, but Paul did. Hard work does matter in this business, but probably not as much as another topic Paul addressed, and that's building relationships. Putting in effort is all well and good, but our business is often about trust and familiarity. And coincidentally, Paul is one of the most trusted and familiar broadcasters in Florida. And I'm still learning from him. Thanks again for listening to Media Credentials. For examples of my work, including video and audio clips, a blog, and my contact page, check out whitwatson.com.